Well, welcome friends. My name is Antonella and I'm your technical host for the webinar. And according to my watch, it's about time for us to start. So I have a few housekeeping items before we get the ball rolling, but I'd like to welcome you all to this webcast and welcome those of you that are viewing us later over the recording as well. The things I'd like to share with you before we begin, for those of you here live, is up in the left-hand corner of your screen. Most of you have found that interactive Q&A chat. Feel free to post questions, comments, responses to questions for you there all the time during our webcast, and we'll try to gather your comments and make sure that we can share them with our presenter. Also, directly above me, you'll see that we have a whole list of recordings. If you scroll down in that box, we only have today and then coming up on June 2nd, the live recordings for this seasons of so many broadcasts that we've done. But there are many recordings available, and we invite you to peruse those archives and see if there are things that interest you that you still might want to review. If you have questions of a technical nature during our broadcast, feel free to post those in the chat box as well, and I'll do my best to try to assist you or to try to troubleshoot problems. And especially if for some reason our sound or video is not working for you, let me know, and I'll do what I can to troubleshoot or to see if there's something we can do.
And welcome friends from wherever you are connecting, whether this morning on the Pacific Coast or somewhere here in the United States, whether it's this afternoon, and to our friends in the UK, we wish you a good evening. And I hope you'll enjoy this time with us this next hour as Mary Hawes, our presenter, shares with us. Today is the final webinar of the Family Matters series, which explores how family life is woven from a complex blend of celebration, transition, and tragedy. And she will offer models of how the wider church community can support and strengthen families when they are fraying at the edges. The session will also help us reflect on the many aspects of family life explored during the series and considering the challenges facing them in their situations. But let me introduce Mary to you. Mary, for many years, has been involved in the church and with children in a variety of ways. Mary serves as the Church of England's National Advisor for Children and Young People's Ministry. Formerly, Mary was a primary school teacher, editor of the Scripture Union, cathedral education officer, and children's advisor for the Diocese of London. Can you imagine Mary has spare time? Well, when she does, she is the priest in a South London Anglican church. She is also an avid football fan and enjoys traveling. And so, Mary, it is a real privilege to have you with us today, and we look forward to your presentation. Blessings to you.
Thank you, Stan, and hello. It's good to be spending the evening with all of you, though it does feel very strange to be sitting here in my office in London staring at a webcam rather than being able to see all your faces. You might like to grab a pencil and a piece of paper in the next few minutes, because as part of the presentation, I'm going to be inviting you to jot down your thoughts and to think about your faith journey. And with all that Stan has said about my career, I still feel very much a novice, very much learning about how, as Christians, we best support families in their times of celebration and transition, in the times of pressure, and also in their times of tragedy. So this is the last in the series of 6 webinars that have been hosted here. You've already had a look at families, households and tribes, considered who is my family, thought about the implications of living faith in the home, considered families in the hood who probably didn't look quite like the people here. Family life has changed an awful lot. And then last time we were considering family ministry and how it changes and how it's complex. And the theme I've been given, the very small theme, is that of from cradle to grave. have the brief of examining those celebrations and traumas, the tensions, the pressures, the tragedies that families go through from the moment of birth right through to the moment of death, at whatever point that might be. And I fear that I will only scratch the surface, and that I may leave you feeling frustrated at the lack of definite answers. But I think that's because we're dealing with people who respond to celebration and transition, who react to pressure and tragedy in very different ways. So maybe by highlighting some of the things that families go through, we'll be able to think about our own contexts and about how we might be able to help. So as we look through the questions and as we go through this evening, I hope that you'll enjoy yourselves. But first, I'd just like to look for a moment at Psalm 139. I think these 3 verses in here are fantastic. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. That I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed to me, when none of them as yet existed. What an incredible thing to have a God whose love and knowledge of us is from before we were born to the days which have not yet existed. And none of us know what tomorrow will hold or what it will bring for us. And yet we do know that God will still be there with us. Each of us lives a unique life. It may be similar in different ways. But we all have unique relationships, unique friendships, unique events and journeys that take us on a road which at times is joyous and breathtaking in its beauty, and at other times is full of rocks and ragged edges, precipices which we think we may well fall over, clouds which cast shadows and which help us to feel that maybe God isn't there. So how can we walk with families in those sorts of situations? Well, first of all, I'd just like you to stop for a moment and think back over your own life's journey. Where has it taken you so far? What have been the moments of celebration? Where have been the transitions that were important to you? Who were the significant people who walked with you? What have been the pressures or the tragedies that you've had to encounter? And who helped you through those dark times? How have you been strengthened and supported in all these times of life? And maybe you could ask yourself, how did the church support and strengthen me in those times? Or were there things that it could have done differently in order to help me? So I'm just going to be quiet for a couple of minutes and invite you to either write things down or, as Stan has said, jot them into the forum box, and Stan will weave some of those things into our conversations later on. I'm sure that that's brought a lot of things to mind. And the reason I'm jumping back in now is it seems very strange to leave you in silence when you come to a webinar. I think for me, one of the most significant times in my personal journey was the time when I was made redundant, when I lost my job through the company having to reduce its resources. I remember feeling very damaged, very hurt, very low. And because it was a Christian company, I remember asking God, what is this all about? You called me to be here. I still feel the call, and yet I'm being cut adrift. And it was very hard to have faith at that time. And I still have a postcard which an older woman in the church gave to me. And on it, and forgive me if I start getting emotional, she wrote, "Don't worry about holding on to your faith. With your family, we'll hold the faith for you." And I think for me that was a light coming on, the realisation that my faith, though personal, is also a faith held by the family of God. That in times of tragedy and difficulty, the family of God, at its best, will be there to hold the faith for us. Our family here in England is very varied in its aspects. Just got a few statistics here for you to have a look at. Although we have lots of headlines of newspapers that seem to say family life is breaking down and falling apart, actually being married with children is still the most common form of family life that we have here in England. But there are a growing number, although quite small, but a growing number of same-gender couples who now have adopted children or had their own children. And most interestingly, over the last decade, the number of households which have 2 or more families living under the same roof has doubled. Now, again, those are small numbers. But it's interesting that the pattern of life is changing. There is a solid centre, married with children, but cohabiting couples are the fastest growing group. Blended families where children move from one parent to be with another parent and their new partner. All of those things contribute to make life seem quite difficult and fraught at times. So where in the Bible might we go to explore some of that? Well, oops. I'm pressing the wrong button, I'm sorry. We'll look at the Bible in just a moment. And you might, just like in your mind, think, where is she going to take us to look for that one? But first of all, just here are a few words that I picked out to do with families. Again, take a moment and have a look at those words. Which of them ring true for you? Which of them seem most significant? Which of them feel as though they shouldn't be there? I wonder which of them we could take away and still have all that we need for family. Again, Stan will weave the thoughts and comments that you have into our conversation later on as we look to see what we're doing with our families and how we describe them and how we help them to live with this huge mix of emotion and energy and events to be in a life that's the best it can be. Rather like this. We're very good in England and probably in most of the Western world at actually being quite private. We don't like people to know when we have troubles. We like to keep the surface stuff to ourselves. And it's rather like having a weaving. When you weave, you need to have tension within the warp threads in order for the weft threads to be able to go through and to create a beautiful pattern on the surface. Many families are able to do that. The tensions that they have, they hold to themselves and still maintain a public front, as it were, of a life that looks as though it's going well. And yet, underneath, perhaps this is more of the hidden reality, that there are mistakes and things of which we're ashamed, relationships which are breaking down, children who are suffering, things which are going wrong, and we don't feel able to bring those to the surface. Tensions of trying to hold those inside can make families feel quite vulnerable. Excuse me while I cough. And it's quite likely that the only people who get a glimpse of that mess and muddle that's underneath the weaving are those who've got close relationships with families, those who have walked with them into the situation and through it, those who are trusted enough with the vulnerability of everyday life. So as churches, How can we help those families who are beginning to fray at the edges, for whom perhaps a transition has become a little more of a problem than just a fresh start, for whom pressure is not necessarily bringing out the best in them, for whom tragedy has appeared to completely destroy what they were hoping for? How can we walk with them so that before everything falls apart, they have a safety net that will strengthen and support them, space where they can be vulnerable and honest, a place where they feel that they can be themselves? Well, that just doesn't happen at times of tragedy and times of pressure. We have to begin that process well in advance by investing time in getting to know people, by bothering to talk to them, not just to the adults, to children and teenagers particularly as well. We have to be ready when things are falling apart, to invest the time, emotional as well as hours, that is needed to help walk somebody through a situation that is overwhelming, something that just feels is impossible to look at. So where might we go to see families like that? Again, excuse me. Well, quite often, the Holy Family in the Bible, Mary, Jesus and Joseph, are held up as the icons to which families should aspire. They're the example by which families are measured sometimes. And we have all that imagery of gentle Jesus, meek and mild, a little boy who was always obedient, always good, a little boy who in our Christmas carols appears not to weep. Our hymnody wraps a bit of a myth, I think, around the Holy Family. Frustratingly, we're not given a glimpse into how Mary and Joseph coped with family life, how they dealt with the reality of this child who was theirs and not theirs, human and yet God. Only Luke gives us a real glimpse into those times in the 30 years before Jesus started his public ministry. And what do we learn from it? Well, there are several things in Luke chapter 2 which you might like to look at later on. Perhaps things that gives us a glimpse into what family life might aspire to be. First, that there was regular worship. Mary and Joseph were with Jesus in the synagogue week by week. He knew God. We don't know what sort of child he was. Did he want to be there? Did he want to be out playing with his friends? Fully human? It's quite possible. But regularly they took him to worship. They also took him up to the temple in Jerusalem. Jesus knew that there was a world wider than the local, that whatever the ins and outs of life in Nazareth, he knew that the Jewish community of which he was a part was bigger than that. In that place, there was an extended family beyond his parents, adults and cousins and relations to whom he could go, people who cared for him, who offered him a different perspective. And there was celebration. Luke 2, as you'll recall, is the celebration of going up for the feast of the Passover, to be with people and to celebrate God's goodness. And in that time, in that great crowd, and in that great city, Jesus was given the freedom to explore, to go to the places where perhaps he wouldn't normally go, to get himself lost and worry his parents, and to come across older generations, to sit and to listen to them, to question them, and to have them question him. It's quite a wonderful sort of life. But actually, if you look a little bit behind that, there was much more going on in Jesus' childhood. Mary and Joseph had the terror of knowing that Herod wanted to kill their only child. And so as a toddler, they had to flee to Egypt, taken away from everything they held dear, going to be in a place that was alien and foreign to them. Then, when the time was safe, they had to come back and re-establish life in a new area, rediscover friends and relatives, a new routine. And then there were the siblings who came along. We read in the Gospels of Jesus' brothers, I wonder how he responded when he was no longer an only child, when Mary divided her attention between her children. And Joseph, realizing that Joseph was not his father, as Jesus grew in his understanding that he was God's child. The death of Joseph, the beloved man who would have shown him how to carve wood, passed on his trade, told him the stories of the faith, possibly talked about the miraculous nature of his birth. All of those were woven into the life of the man who at 30 came and taught us about God. So let's stop just for a few minutes, and Stan will help to weave in some of the comments that you've been making, and let's have a bit of a conversation about what you've heard so far of your own lives, of the points of celebration and tension, trauma, pressure, tragedy, and what we've read in Scripture.
Well, Mary, some of the comments started with your first question, and we've talked about people who have mentored us and cared for us on a positive side, and then there have been those that have also experienced the not so positive or healthy side of a congregation. Robert shared, sometimes we who minister either have difficulty receiving care through our own tragedies, or sometimes congregants don't know how or don't care to care for ministers. Enton shares that in his own journey, the church has not always been helpful and at times oppositional and harmful, and at other times very supportive. So he's seen experienced the scope of it. Sean shares that she has been surprised by the folk who have come alongside and walked with her through some transitions, and it hasn't always been those who she expected, but was definitely those who she needed for that particular situation. And then Katie has shared that her church has been helpful and supportive for key milestones and major trials, and she shares that she doesn't think they view her as a minister in the traditional sense, so that they provided care and support more typical of a lay member. And then we've been having some conversation about the challenge of it is for a family to just be real, rather than having to put on the facade or put on a face. And so we've had some comments about is the congregation that providing that kind of support, or does the congregation enable families to be authentic rather than to have to live into some kind of assumption and perhaps like a pure model like what you shared in terms of the story of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus?
That's a lot of really interesting comments there, and I think it shows how when we come together as the family of God, we have all the messiness that families have there. We have the people who don't know how to help. We have the people who perhaps want to help and don't know how to respond. I found Sean's comment particularly interesting, that it was the unexpected people, not the obvious ones, who helped. And maybe that says something to us about the importance of not compartmentalizing our church lives. That if we only ever put people, I'm going to talk about that a little later on in the presentation, if we only ever put people into silos or into age groups or interest groups, perhaps we miss the opportunity to be blessed and supported by somebody that we wouldn't have expected. In one of the churches I used to go to, we had a 90-year-old. She always had one of those wicked twinkles in her eye, and she wasn't very mobile, but she was one of the people who was best at welcoming strangers into the church, because she would beckon them to come and sit beside her, and then when it came to time to take communion, she would ask them to take her arm to help her up. And that led into conversations. She was particularly pleased if they were rather nice-looking young men, I have to say. She still had an eye for the young men at 90. But she made many friendships. And when she died, it wasn't just those of her generation who mourned her, but a whole range of people who'd been touched by the fact that she bothered to listen to them week after week, because she had time just to sit and be. It was quite a special occasion. I feel very blessed to have known her.
Yeah. I think it also says something that if we allow ourselves to be open to others, that people will also be more open to receiving us as well, and finding those ways of support, perhaps from the unexpected, whom we never imagined. Scott also makes a comment. When I was looking for answers from God, I was startled to receive the answers through members of the congregation. Then also, and Anton responds, that is a very profound statement, and perhaps Scott may want to say more. And then Katie shares, I'm learning that the church should be the context to live out of grace for each of us and for one another. When we embody God's grace, when the mask can come down and we can find love and acceptance based on our true human selves seeking to become mature in Christ. I don't feel free to share our struggles as sinners. We aren't able to receive and give love.
And that's often the hardest thing, to actually admit that we struggle, because sometimes the way that people expect Christians to be, there's this assumption that we will be perfect. There's this assumption that we won't experience everything else that humanity experiences. And yet we do, of course we do. But learning to be able to share that with those with whom you don't yet feel comfortable, or who you perhaps don't quite trust, is very difficult. That's why the church is such a glorious mess. Unfortunately, sometimes is a glorious muddle that isn't helpful.
Yeah.
Should we continue?
Let's continue.
Should we move on? So some of the celebrations, let's just look for a few minutes at some of the things that people might celebrate, or the transitions they go through. I haven't got answers of how we support and strengthen in each of these situations, because people react, very differently to all of these things of life. And family celebrations can be large, such as the things I've written up here, but they can also be quite small. Not all of them on the screen, not all of the celebrations there on the screen. But when you have a baby, you celebrate like mad when the first steps are taken and when the first words are said. And of course the irony is that, having encouraged the child to walk and to talk, as soon as we bring them into church, we need to confine them and tell them to be quiet. They've just learnt these new skills, and we don't always celebrate them. But birth does bring out in many people the desire to celebrate. They want to say thank you for this amazing life that has been created. They want to acknowledge their seemingly inability to care for this creation. How do we respond as churches when families approach us to help with the celebration of the birth of their child? Now, I'm sure that amongst the people here, we've got many different ways of doing that. I'm an Anglican priest. We offer welcome through baptism, through Thanksgiving services. It may be that your congregation offers a blessing. But when people approach your pastor or minister or priest, and they're not members of your congregation, and yet they say, we would like to give thanks for our child, what response do they receive? Is it one of irritation at the church just being taken for granted? Is it one of joy? Is it one of, oh no, not something else to do? In the Church of England, we've had what's been called the Christenings Project, and research has been done with non-church families who've brought a child for baptism. And most of those who came said that they felt a spiritual awakening, that with the birth of a child, there was a sense of something bigger than themselves being there. And they couldn't put words on it, but they knew that the church could help to put a language and a celebration around that. They also said that most of them wanted to be invited back to continue to share the life of the church. and that almost without exception, they weren't invited back to anything. Contact wasn't kept up. The words of "we welcome you," which are said in every Anglican baptism service, weren't lived up to. And we know that quite often it's 4 or 5 or 6 invitations that are needed before somebody will respond. So perhaps that raises a question for us as churches. How do we strengthen and support families in these celebration times when it seems that a door is open to helping the parents explore their spiritual journey? Do we help to take that, just leave it to the priest, but by involving them in the life of the church, offer them a glimpse into God? Do we welcome families in marriage and recognise blending of families? Do we celebrate, or is it all just a private occasion? The celebrations are perhaps easier. We can sing happy birthday at the end of a service, we can cakes and candles, and in my church we always have wine. We can celebrate with joy. But do we seek out people who would like to celebrate but don't know how to say, "It's my significant birthday," or "I'm about to adopt a child and I would just like to thank God"? What are the possibilities for doing that? And then what about some of the transitions? Perhaps the biggest transition is into becoming a family from being a household. But becoming a parent brings huge changes for people. It's a transition which brings new responsibilities and may also, for maybe at least one of the parents, be a transition out of the world of paid employment into a world of being at home with a child. That can feel quite lonely if you're in a place where you haven't got family. Maybe you've recently moved there, you haven't even got many friends. How do we help people as they approach parenthood to be strengthened and supported? In my congregation, and I'm sure in many congregations, we have a toddler service, a chance for parents to come along with their little ones, not to worry about noise, but also to find adult company, also to find older people, so peers with whom they can share experiences, the wisdom of the elders, helping them with the difficulties of feeding, the worry that their child is developing normally. And then the starting or changing of school. For some children, that can be quite daunting to move from the safe security of being at home with a parent into a much bigger class where the expectation is that you will do as you're told, that you will learn to share, that you will learn to work alongside others. Do we pray and support children in that? When they come to their secondary school, to high school, the transition from perhaps a small primary school into a much bigger unit can be terrifying for some young people. Do we offer mentors, older young people who've gone through it, who just explore their experiences with those who are about to go through? Do we encourage our schools to have transition days where secondary school and primary school can meet together? Do we regularly pray for the children and their parents as they come to that place? Then when all those hormones kick in, that's often the time when older adults are vital, when parents seem to be the last person that you can talk to, and the relationships between younger and older, perhaps skipping a generation, are so important. But those relationships will only be those of trust if they've begun much younger. Allowing the generations to come together is hugely important if we are to be able to build relationships across the generations, building into people's lives significant others. And when people move into our area, the moving house, the moving away from us or the moving into us, do we have a pack which people can pop through the door? Whether people are going to come to church or not is irrelevant. The welcome into community is important. A card that says, "I'm glad that you've moved into our street. Here's my email address. Do come round for a coffee. Or we have a church if you want to be part of that or would like to see what goes on." offering the hand of friendship as people move into new situations. We have the pressure points. Now, some people love pressure. For some people, they thrive on it. Give them pressure and they will just respond. Others, it's much harder. When you bring two families together and have two sets of in-laws, whose expectations are that you will continue their particular family's traditions, and you want to start your own family traditions. How's that helped? How do we sit and listen to young couples as they work out those difficulties, which can put pressure onto a new relationship just born into a marriage? The decisions to be made about work, and perhaps the financial constraints that we have in this time at the moment. Finances, certainly in the UK, are still very dodgy. A lot of people struggle, and the work that the Children's Society has done, which looks at a lot of the impacts of government policies, they've found that many families are actually only one bill away from falling into poverty, that they are only just able to keep up. There's a movement in England called Make Lunch, and it was started by a group of Christians in Luton who realised that children who were on the poverty threshold and who were receiving free school meals during school time were not having any meals during half terms and school holidays. That the hot meal to sustain them in their school day wasn't there. And so they began the Make Lunch campaign, which takes over premises and provides meals, sandwiches, soup, something simple and nutritious that's offered to those who wouldn't otherwise be able to have a meal. But they don't say it's just for those who are poor. They don't put that demarcation on it. It's open to anyone. And they include the whole community in providing the food for it, in helping to prepare, to serve, to sit down and talk with these children. And they found that families come along as well. A parent will just pop in to see what's going on and will stay and also have something to eat. I wonder if sometimes in our churches we give the impression that although we don't hold money as our highest calling, we actually unwittingly put pressure on people in terms of how we price events that we invite them to. Come along and have lunch. It'll only cost you £5. That can be a huge amount of money, and some people may exclude themselves from being part of a wider social context simply because they can't afford it. Do we invest in lots of technological equipment, which is good, there's nothing wrong with that, but might give the impression that we have idolised stuff rather than thought about our worship of God and our serving of our neighbours? And then there are those times which none of us hope to go through. The times of tragedy. 2 years ago, I had one of the saddest things I've ever had to do as a priest when I took the funeral of a 2-year-old. He'd been born with a life-threatening illness and spent his last days in a hospice. His mother said the hardest thing is that nobody wants to mention his name. They're worried that it will upset us. She said, my heart can't break anymore, and actually it helps to hear his name mentioned, to know that people remember him and remember that I was his mother. Her words to me reminded me that sometimes we avoid talking to people about their tragedies. I'm not suggesting that we should go in and ask people to bare their souls, but by offering the possibility that we can listen without offering judgment, but giving the space for someone to talk about their loss, about what's happened. How can we help people who perhaps feel that their marriage has failed and they have let God and the community down because of a relationship breakdown that's led to separation and divorce? Where is the safe space for children to be able to talk in terms that they may not feel able to express to their parents in case they hurt them? How can they express the worry that they might be the ones who have caused this? it comes back again to the building of relationships that aren't just there for the tragic moments, but go beyond it. In a previous church I was in, we had a couple for whom the joy and celebration of the birth of their child was tempered by the fact that he had a very severe disability. They weren't sure how they would cope. And rather like Sean said, it was a most unexpected couple who provided the support for this young family. An older couple in the church, retired, so they had time, took it upon themselves to every day go along and help with the boy's therapy, to help to do the physiotherapy, to move the limbs, to act as just listening ears for the mother who was at home with him. They did it without heralding that they were doing it. I only found out some time afterwards. And that secret, hidden commitment to being with people was an absolute lifeline to that young family. But of course, I've made it look as though celebration and transition and pressure and tragedy all happen in separate little boxes. Of course it doesn't. Family life is messy, and the celebration of birth can be tinged with that awful realization that your child has an illness or a disability. Pressure of exams can also be in celebration of a significant birthday that's happening at the same time. The sadness of leaving friends and moving to another part of the country can have the delight of discovering new people and new places. Our lives are woven together in all of this, and we don't live our lives as a tragedy or as a pressure or as a transition, nor do we live them just as a celebration. We live them in the wholeness of life. That's where the words of John Westerhoff, for me, become quite significant. A church can't play the role of family, but it can be a familial place, a community of nurture for parents and children. Church at its best is a community that nurtures us in all of those tragedies, those pressures, those transitions, that allows us to celebrate even in the midst of darkness, that offers relationship and friendship beyond the ties of blood and of marriage, that offers children adults who are interested in them, simply because they are fellow human beings. John Westerhoff speaks a lot about the importance of that community, a community that celebrates together, a community that worships together, a community that is open enough to welcome stranger and friend, to not divide them, a community that will be sacrificial in breaking off from its own friendship groups in order to welcome others in. A community in which the nurture is two ways. For this webinar series has been about families, but single people and households without children have their part to play as well. They too go through tragedy and celebration, through pressure and trauma. A single student away from home may need the love and warmth of a family to help them get used to being apart from their blood family. A single person may offer that companionship and friendship to a parent who is feeling withdrawn from others. We need to see the whole of the mess and joy of our Christian communities as being able to offer us life-giving times. That should be true too in our worship. Worship which is only ever celebratory and doesn't allow us to recognize the need for confession, the need for lamentation, the need to acknowledge before God that life can be a real mess and hard at times, is important. But our worship can also offer us stability in the midst of what may feel like shifting sands, and the ability to offer our worth at whatever age is also incredibly important to help us be bedded in the place. But too often what we do in our churches is play pass the parcel. We end up parceling people into age groups, into stage groups, into interest groups. So we parcel children into the creche age, and then we neatly parcel them up again and pass them to the youngest Sunday school, and then we parcel them up again and pass them to the next stage in Sunday school, and eventually we parcel them up and pass them, if they're still there, to the youth group. What might happen if we undid the strings on those parcels and invited people to be all ages together at any time? What if we welcomed older people to sit and be part of our Sunday school groups? What if we had social events at times when our young people could be there? What if we sought out their skills and drew them into the service of God, helping them to deal with the PowerPoint presentations, to deal with the sound, to be part of the church community? What if we stopped playing pass the parcel? We actually opened up and saw the gift of people, and not just their ages and their stages. Maybe then our churches would become places where we can genuinely welcome and reflect God's love to all who come in, where our worship is rooted in reality, that doesn't pretend we're in a sacred bubble for that hour when we're together, when there's space beyond Sunday. Or if we're only ever trying to support and strengthen relationships in that 1 hour, we're going to fail. We need to have places beyond Sunday where we meet, where we worship, where we socialise, and where the generations come together, and young people and older people can discover significant others who will walk with them through the difficulties of life. There are also stumbling blocks. And maybe some of these are things that we've come across in our churches. Brendan Hyde did some research in Australia, and he worked with 9 to 11-year-olds in schools and talked with them about their spiritual lives. And he found that there were 4 things that stopped them developing. The first was materialism. If we place a great emphasis on stuff and not the real things of life, we may well not allow people to glimpse God. If we're so worried about the material possessions of our church, about getting new Bibles, new hymn books, new robes for the choir, those things can be important, and I'm not wanting to dismiss them. But if we give the impression that we're only bothered about what we can give materially, that will be a stumbling block to families who are in difficulties and who are fraying at the edges. Trivialising of faith and not taking it seriously was also a stumbling block to the children thinking that God was interested in them. We trivialise the tragedies of life. It's quite easy to assume that people will get over things much more quickly than they actually do. The trauma of a broken relationship may take years to heal. We assume that people will move on quite quickly. And perhaps we need to learn to slow down. That's what the last thing that he found. The dismissing of things was also important, but actually he found the most important thing was that people need time. That these young people he talked with said nobody had the time to sit and talk with them. Adults and families, children and young people need us to take the time just to stop and listen to them, to give them the time that will allow them to open up, to trust us, to be vulnerable. I know that earlier in the webinar series somebody's mentioned it takes a village to raise a child. I've lived in a village. I also know that a village can be a very divisive place, but our churches aren't perfect villages. Villages can be quite sniffy to newcomers. They can feel very isolated when the bus service has been cut off. They can feel quite excluding. And yet, at their best, they offer community to rich and poor alike, to old and young, places to meet and places to be. That ought to be what our churches can be. But quite often we ghettoise. It's those parcels again. We put like people together, and we forget to build the bridges that will allow them to find the unexpected person who may be the one that offers the support, the unlikely person who has the right word to say. In our churches, people are going through times of difficulty. Are they in or out? Or do we put them into a ghetto? Stan, what things have people been saying? Or have they all gone away? Have we still got people who are engaging with how we might help those who are struggling in the traumas and tragedies of life?
There is quite a lively discussion taking place in the chat box. Several people have shared how the church has been supportive, everything from helping with an adoption of a daughter and the struggle of relationships, talking about how we welcome people into the community when they move in. And then there have also been different kinds of support ministries, especially like for families or people with Alzheimer's or memory issues or autism, some of those things. One thing that has come up was your use of pass the parcel. And they really like that image, but also what are some thoughts that you have in terms of helping to change that mindset in the church?
Oh, I would be a rich woman if I could write a book that gave you the answer to that, Stan. I think it's slow. I think there needs to be a commitment to letting go of our own preferences sometimes. It needs to be initially clergy-led, I think, but not only by the clergy. I think ministers, because of the role that they have, can be very influential. I think we need to, perhaps in our training of ministers and pastors and priests, help them to explore what are the challenges to dropping the age and stage mentality, to being open to building small groups. And I think sometimes small is very important. I haven't talked about the importance of home groups or cell groups, places where people can come together regularly and get to know each other, perhaps in the context of somebody's house or home, and over time begin to be able to be vulnerable. It's not going to happen if we only think they're going to sit there in our pews on a Sunday morning. It needs to be much more determined than that. And if we find that we've got pastors or ministers who aren't on board with it, then maybe we, as those who are committed, can begin to think, how can I draw 2 or 3 people together with whom I can pray and with whom we can be very determined about inviting people for lunch, for a meal, for a social event, and not just our friends, but the stranger, the person that we wouldn't naturally be drawn to. It's easier to do that if 2 or 3 of you are contracting to be supporting each other in it. And maybe by that we can begin to change the culture, which can still be prevalent in our churches of, I'll stick with my friends, thank you very much, the people that I am like, the people that I like. We forget Christ's call to support and be with the stranger and those whom others don't want to be with.
It would seem like the Eucharist table is a wonderful model of how to change that mindset of sharing the bread, the wine, and coming together to fellowship and to share in that, in the body and blood of Christ.
It would be. Unfortunately, some of our churches, and mine is one of them, have rules and regulations about who is welcome at the table. At the Last Supper, Jesus didn't say, make sure that you believe before you do this. He said, do this to remember me. And I think that where we can offer that genuine welcome, and in my denomination, we do now admit children to communion. They don't have to wait until they're older. And that's making a huge difference to the approach of families as they come as a family to God's table. And they receive the bread and the wine together and have that foretaste of being with the diversity of God, and have that strengthening of coming close to God in the bread and the wine. that is always there, whatever their life situation might be.
Yeah. Katie makes the comment, sometimes admitting we don't know what to say or that it's okay just to listen rather than saying platitudes which can trivialize issues. Sometimes it's our approach to leadership and how we choose to engage each other in the church and community that can often be one of the biggest obstacles. What might be ways that you mentioned, bringing groups together and interacting with each other. Are there other things that come to mind that leaders can work at in terms of helping to break down those barriers of the parceling?
Oh, Stan, I wish I could give you an answer for that one. That would be so much easier to make something up instead of saying, actually, it's very hard. I think the breaking down comes in small things. Sometimes at festivals and in celebrations, people are more willing to talk to each other. In my church, when we bring everybody together for what we call our all-age service, sometimes the adults are much freer to talk with each other and begin to make those connections. But it's hard. I'm part of a Facebook group which is called Killing Sunday School. And it's not about killing Sunday School, but it is about promoting all-age church and intergenerational church. And it's a group which seems to be quite open to having new members. I'm learning a lot from that about how to pick up techniques, pick up good ideas, and actually having the courage to fail, to risk getting it wrong, to risk the snide comment. Perhaps sometimes we have to make ourselves vulnerable and actually put ourselves into the situation in order for things to begin to change.
Shall we move on and allow you to bring your presentation, finish your presentation?
Yeah, I've just got a couple of more slides. And in many ways, these 6 webinars have only scratched the surface and helped us to explore just a few of the issues that surround family life in an increasingly complex world. If you think back to my illustration at the beginning of the weaving, the tension of the warp and the weaving through of the weft. Families are constantly weaving the celebration and transition, the pressure and the tragedy together. We need to be part of that weaving, and by making ourselves vulnerable and helping others to see that we too do that, actually help them to feel confident enough to begin to be supported by others. The story continues here in England in that in September we have a conference which is going to be looking much deeper at family matters. We call it We Are Family. The denominations are coming together to explore family in its great complexity, diversity and joyous messiness. And if you're in England, you are more than welcome to come and to join us. I also want to leave you with one more scripture passage. It's this one from Matthew 25. I'm going to do a little paraphrase. I've written it up here for you. But I was hungry for relationship. Did you give me food to sustain me? I was thirsty to know how I could cope with my grandmother who has Alzheimer's and my child who has Downs. Did you give me something to drink to refresh me in all that I am going through? I was a stranger. I walked into your congregation, and did you say hello? I made myself vulnerable. Did you turn your eyes away, or did you give me the clothing of love and care and concern? I was sick and tired and weary and worn out. Did you take care of me? I was in a prison of my traumas and my tragedies and my pressures, and I had no way of getting out of them. Did you visit me and sit with me and hold me in all of that? For truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. God who loves us from before we were born to the days which don't even yet exist is the God who wants to draw all people to himself and to help them to see his love made flesh in us. The families, the households, the singles, the older, the younger. Wonderful vision of Zechariah's of coming together and playing and being with each other. The church is far from perfect. The church is very messy. But the church is what God has chosen to work through here on earth. May God bless you as you seek to support and strengthen family life in whichever situation you are in at the moment. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mary. Such a wonderful and enriching presentation, and also to everyone that shared with their comments, just quite lively and engaging. I'm going to invite Anton in to take care of some closing household items, and Anton, if you'll do that.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Mary, for a great presentation so far. I'm looking forward to the few closing comments that you and Stan might make, so stand by. But for those of us who are participants in the webinar, there's two quick questions I invite you to respond to. The first was, how helpful was the presentation, the content and the learning that Mary provided? And then secondly, how well did this webinar format work for you, this online meeting? And for those of you from the Church of the Brethren seeking continuing education units, here are the instructions on how you can complete that form online. I'll also post a live link over in the chat window so you can just click when it's time to go. But thank you so much for attending, and Stan and Mary, back to you.
Well, Mary, Robert Morris shares, he really likes your statement about the church being a glorious mess. Is there anything that you would like to add to that comment, that statement, perhaps that you did not have a chance to earlier in the webinar?
I think the church is a glorious mess, and the moment we start thinking that the church needs to put on its Sunday best and only ever be well-dressed and present itself, then we've lost sight of what our Christian faith is about and the God who calls us to live truly human with a truly divine connection. Glorious mess it just sums it up for me. I think most of us can identify with mess. Some of us don't like it. Some of us create it a bit too much. But if we try to pretend that the church is anything other than God's creation coming together in our imperfection to worship a God who is perfect, then we will never be able to cope or welcome those for whom the mess of their lives isn't glorious. We need to be able to have the inglorious mess alongside our glorious mess. And somehow, through the mess, see to God.
Well, yeah, your presentation did so well at reminding us that the church needs, in order to strengthen and support families, needs to be for single people, family, whatever their walk of life is, in both the good and the bad, and to find those entry points of where people have those times of celebration, and that we don't lose sight of people as well.
That's right. It is so easy to lose sight of people, the vulnerable who will sit on the edge, those who want to be part of worship but aren't sure they believe, those who come with a burden of guilt for whatever reason and want to talk but don't want to be approached. We need to make those people visible in a way that's appropriate and sensitive, that allows them to know that they're noticed and known and loved.
Yeah, so much so. Well, a number of people are expressing their thanks to you for the wonderful presentation. And Mary, I just want to say thank you so much for such a marvelous presentation. The content was just terrific. And could I ask for a copy of your closing, your paraphrase of your scripture passage? I would love to use that in another setting as well. And I thought that was...
I'll send it over.
All right. And for anyone that would like a copy of Mary's slides in a PowerPoint, if you contact me at this address, and we will send you a PDF copy. That way you can use it with your congregation and with people in your church to help them change that pass the parcel mindset. Here is the address that you'll want to click on and link to. Well, Mary, thank you so much. Thank you for your ministry and how you've shared that with us today, how we have been blessed by your wisdom and your experience. And we wish you God's peace and grace as you continue in your ministry with the Church of England and as a parish priest as well. And Anton, thank you for your technical support and expertise, so greatly appreciated and needed. And for everyone who attended today, we could not do these without you. And also I want to give a shout out to Sean Hancock, who has been helping to organize and to plan many of these webinars, especially the Family Matters series. Sean is the director of the Center for Family and Youth Studies at Bristol Baptist College. And so, Sean, thank you for your support as well. Well, everyone, we're going to wish you a good afternoon and a good evening, and God's blessings upon you. Peace and grace. Bye-bye.